The remote repository is on GitHub, but it's empty at the moment. This means we don't have any branches or any commits in it. Now we have plenty of options on how to change this. One option would be to create a new repository on the command line. This sounds a bit strange as we have a repository already, but it simply means that we add a commit and the branch to this empty remote repository. We'll go with the second option though, so we'll push an existing repository from the command line. In our case, we use the command line from inside VS Code. Now, you see that we have to execute some commands in here, but to establish the connection between our local and remote repository, we first need a local repository. Therefore, I'm back on the desktop and I'll first create a new folder here, so new, and I'll name this folder equal to the repository name that we used on GitHub. So we called it GitHub Basics, and I'll go with the same naming convention right here now. Then I'll open a new empty Visual Studio Code project. So here we are. And now I'll drag this GitHub Basics folder into this Visual Studio Code window. Yes, we again trust the authors. And let me now maximize this window. Close the welcome screen, go to View, Appearance, and Show Panel. And let me clear this terminal down here. And now, inside this new project, I'll create a new folder. And I will name it Master, as this will be our default branch name once again. And inside this master folder, I'll add a new file, m1.txt, so master1.txt, just to have kind of the structure that we use in Git being, well, kind of reflected in the folder and file naming convention once again. Now we'll, of course, initialize our local Git repository, and we will first add the folder and the file to this first commit, and now commit this change, including a commit message, simply m1, as we added this m1 text file into this commit. Let's confirm this. So the first commit was created, and if we now clear this once again and show our branch with git branch, you see we have our master branch created. Now the question is, how can we bring this information, so basically this branch, and with git log we can also have a look at the commit inside this branch, so this information, to our remote repository. Back in GitHub, we see how this works. First, we have to execute this command right here. We saw it on the slide earlier already, so the git keyword is nothing new. Then remote add to add the remote connection, so the connection between the local and the remote repository. At the end, we have the unique URL. So this is the unique URL pointing towards this remote repository. And ahead of the URL, we have the shorthand for this URL, which helps us to refer to this specific repository later. The default name here is origin. As I said, you can name it differently. We'll go with the default naming convention though throughout this course. We could copy the entire command. I'll just copy here the URL actually. And now go back to VS Code. And let me bring this up a bit maybe. And now we'll add git remote add. Now the shortened, so the default one, origin, a space, and now we paste our URL right here. This should, well, establish the connection between our two repositories. So let's see if this works. Well, we don't have any kind of information about whether this was successful, but we also don't get an error. So how can we continue now, assuming that the connection was established? Well, we could continue with this second step here, this command git branch -M main. This would rename our master branch to the main branch. I talked about this convention change also earlier in the course already. You can change the name to main if you want to. I'll stick to the, well, historically evolved branch naming convention of the core branch of a repository being named master. Therefore, we can skip this step and continue with the third step. So git push -u origin main. What about this now? Well, git push is simply a command meaning that we want to, well, push, so bring our local changes, our local information from the local repository to a remote repository. -u is something a bit more advanced. It establishes a so-called upstream between this local branch and the remote branch. We'll of course explore what this means, but to understand upstreams, we need to dive a bit deeper into GitHub. Therefore, we'll skip this at this stage of the course and just continue with origin main here. Origin here is now the reference to our specific remote repository. You remember we added the URL here, the unique URL, and the shorthand origin, this one here, and now we refer to this URL via this origin keyword. So in case you used a different name right here, make sure to use this name also down here for the git push command. And we have to add main here, or in our case master, because we can of course push information from a local repo to a remote repo, but we have to be explicit about which branch this information should be added to. Here you can either use an existing branch name in case the repo would not be empty, or in our case, as the repository is empty, we have to be explicit about which branch should be created. So we'll use the master name here. So the whole command will be git push origin master. So let's add this here, git push origin master. Let's give this a try. And here we get a pop-up now. Let's put this to the center here. Now this pop-up simply tells us now that we don't have the permission by default to, well, add any kind of information to this remote repository that we created on GitHub. This would be an issue, as you can imagine, because as you saw, we created a public repository, so a repo anybody can see. But of course, not everybody can push information to this repo. Therefore, we have two options now to, well, be able to push our information to this remote repo. We could either sign in with the browser. This is kind of a dated approach though, which will no longer be supported by GitHub in the future. This would mean you would have to enter your GitHub email and your password to get access to this repo. Or alternatively, and that's the approach we will follow, we have to enter a personal access token. What is this now? We need a personal access token to be able to push our data to the remote repository. We, as creators of this remote repository, can create such an access token. For this, we can scroll up again here in our current repository. Now access our profile, well, menu here to the right. Here we go down to settings now, this option. On this page, we scroll down until we see the developer settings, so these settings right here. And in here, we can now find the option to create a so-called personal access token. Let's select this option. And here we can now create a token. And if we enter this token then in Git, as we just saw it, this token grants us access to this repository and therefore allows us to, well, add information to this remote repository, in our case, to push our local branch information to the remote branch we have here in our remote repository. Therefore, if we go to generate new token, we can add a note about what this token is for. We could call this token for GitHub module in Git course. For example, here we could define the expiration of this token. I'll set it to 30 days here. You can of course change it according to your needs. And then down here we can define the access this token grants. So we can of course say that we have access to the repository in general by clicking or selecting this repo option here. We can update GitHub Action workflows, also okay. We can write packages. I'm of course aware that you're not totally sure about what this means at this stage, but this will be topics we'll cover later in this course. Therefore, this, well, token should give us access to all these options. We can also delete packages. We can skip all the admin part here. This is not important for us at the moment as we don't dive into the admin part here. We can create gists. We can access user data. We can delete repositories. We can also write discussions. Again, I'll skip the admin part though. With this, we can generate this token. Here it is. And this is now our personal access token. This is of course a different one in your case. Now click onto this symbol here to copy this token. Now we can go back to Visual Studio Code and open this pop-up once again. There we can now paste token and click sign in. Now we see that, well, something obviously was successful. We wrote something to this URL that we established the connection to, and we created a new branch, the master branch in here. Let's see what we created in GitHub now as a next step.